After her second divorce, Ana Trujillo drifted into her 40s, enjoying the single life.
House to house, apartment to apartment, man to man.
But that all changed when she met a Swedish-born scientist named Stefan Andersson.
He was very cosmopolitan.
He was brilliant, highly educated.
And quite the gentleman.
He puts women on a pedestal.
An 18th-story pedestal, to be exact.
A beautiful condominium overlooking Herman Park.
They had doormen, they had valet parking.
But they wouldn't have much time.
I need help.
Just months after they moved in together, Stefan would be dead.
Like a scene from a horror movie.
Was it self-defense?
I couldn't breathe and I was suffocating.
Or did Ana have anger issues?
That is what makes her so dangerous.
Either way, one thing about the killing was guaranteed to grab headlines: her choice of weapon.
This crazed woman stabbed someone with her stiletto heel.
Houston, Texas, June 9, 2013. At 3:41 that Sunday morning, Harris County dispatchers received a frantic phone call from one of the city's most exclusive addresses, a high-rise condo building in the upscale museum district.
I need help.
This is a very dramatic 911 call. She is crying, she is sobbing at certain points, and she can almost be described as hysterical.
Ma'am, calm down.
The caller was 44-year-old Ana Trujillo. She told the dispatcher that her boyfriend, Stefan Andersson, had just attacked her.
He started hitting me up.
Despite that, Ana said she wasn't the one who needed help. It was Stefan.
He's bleeding, he's about to die. He started beating me up and I defend myself.
But now, her priority appeared to be saving Stefan's life.
Ana pleads for someone to send an ambulance and says that they need to get there quickly, that he's dying.
I need you here right now.
Police and paramedics rushed to the scene. And when Ana met the first officer at the door of Stefan's condo, he quickly realized that she hadn't been exaggerating.
He sees Ana Trujillo soaked in blood.
And that was nothing compared to the scene inside the condo.
The carpet was soaked and saturated. There was blood spatter all over the walls.
There was so much blood that it looked like a scene from a horror movie.
And Stefan was the most horrifying of all. The 59-year-old pharmaceutical researcher lay sprawled on the floor, his face a bloody ruin.
Stefan Andersson was not even recognizable. He did not look like a person.
In fact, Stefan's injuries were so severe that the officer at the scene made an automatic assumption about what caused them.
They thought it was a gunshot.
The first responding officer immediately asks her, "Where is the weapon?"
And that's when things took a surprising turn, because the weapon Ana pointed to on the bloody floor wasn't a gun. It was a shoe.
There was a 5.5-inch blue suede stiletto heel within inches of Stefan Andersson's head.
But did the apparently improvised weapon support Ana's story about a frantic life-or-death struggle? Or, in a fit of anger, had she simply lashed out with the first thing that came to hand? Born in 1969, Ana Trujillo grew up in Waco, Texas, part of a family of strict Jehovah's Witnesses.
She seemed to have a very supportive family.
They weren't well off, though, and Ana never went to college. Instead, she got married straight out of high school.
She was around 19 years old at the time, and her husband worked off and on, but Ana was the main support of the house.
Outgoing and attractive, she made good money as a sales rep for the local Coca-Cola bottler.
She did very well at it, and she was with Coca-Cola around 10 or 12 years.
Ana and her husband had 2 daughters together, but split in 2000.
Ana Trujillo eventually was divorced.
She spent the next year as a single mom.
Anna had custody of her 2 daughters.
And then in 2001, Anna met and married a new man, and the family moved to suburban Houston.
They wanted to be closer to her new husband's son.
Life in Houston was an eye-opening experience for a woman who grew up poor in Waco.
This was the first time that Anna had lived in a big city, and she fell in love with Houston.
But after 7 years of marriage, she fell out of love with her second husband.
That marriage subsequently ended in divorce.
And with her daughters all but grown, Anna embarked on a new life.
Her 2 daughters were living with him out in the suburbs, and Anna moved down into the city.
In the city, the 39-year-old found a new career.
She did work as a licensed massage therapist.
She was quite outgoing, very animated, kind of a go-getter. She knew what she wanted to do, and she was out doing it.
And mostly what the newly single Anna wanted to do was enjoy life.
She just changed drastically.
In ways that were a complete 180 from her background and upbringing.
Her family was religious.
Anna never drank very much. She was starting to drink more. She got really involved in the nightlife.
She frequented bars and restaurants. She liked lots of attention, and she liked to go out and party.
And when Anna partied, she partied hard.
She liked tequila shots.
She was just a loose cannon. You didn't know what you were going to expect from Anna Trujillo.
She got plenty of attention, too.
People were always attracted to her.
Especially men.
Anna Trujillo traded on her sexuality.
For drinks, meals, and places to stay.
She didn't have her own apartment, her own place.
She was somewhat of a drifter. She went from house to house, apartment to apartment, man to man.
Which was basically how Anna first met Stefan Anderson.
Anna was staying with a man who was living on one of the upper floors in the same condominium building.
So they met each other in the hall.
And they hadn't been talking long before Anna discovered that the debonair older man with the accent was single. Born in 1954, Stefan was a respected pharmaceutical researcher.
He was brilliant, highly educated.
Originally from Sweden, he had been in the States since the 1980s.
He really liked America because people are really friendly and open here.
He was very cosmopolitan.
When he met Anna, the well-traveled scientist had recently given up a pharmaceutical research job in Dallas to become a professor at the University of Houston.
He taught biochemistry.
Although both positions paid well.
Stefan Anderson lived in a rather affluent high-rise.
The building did have a concierge at the front. They had doormen. They had valet parking.
And when Stefan bumped into Anna in the lobby of his building in August of 2012, he was more than happy to strike up a conversation with the attractive woman.
She was really outgoing, really funny. She was really entertaining.
Anna appeared equally enamored with the 58-year-old scientist, because when Stefan asked if she would like to get a drink later, she immediately said yes, despite the fact that she was staying with a different man in the building.
That relationship was ending.
They'd end up going out that evening together.
And within days, she was spending her nights with Stefan, too.
It didn't take long before they moved in together.
Not that they spent too many evenings in Stefan's condo.
They would go to various restaurants and bars there in the museum district.
This is one of the best areas in Houston.
Lots of fine museums, fine restaurants, lots of interesting nightlife.
And Stefan always picked up the check.
He puts women on a pedestal.
Even if their relationship raised a few eyebrows among Stefan's elite social circle.
Their relationship, to a lot of people, is bizarre.
You have a woman, she doesn't have an education to speak of. You have a world-renowned scientist. People are wondering, what are those two doing together?
Some people, perhaps, But for others, it was obvious.
She was 44, he was 59.
He was very happy and proud to show her off.
He told a friend that he'd met a hot Latino woman and that he was really enjoying it.
And in some ways, Anna may have been good for him, too.
He was a shy man.
He was not assertive in any way.
At least, that's what everyone thought. But less than a year after they first met, a late-night 911 call would leave the police wondering, was Stefan really that mild-mannered? Or did the research scientist's suave exterior mask a brutal secret?
Okay, ma'am, hello?
On June 9th, 2013, Houston police responded to an urgent 911 call from the Park Lane, one of the most exclusive addresses in town.
A beautiful condominium overlooking Herman Park.
Minutes earlier, 44-year-old Anna Trujillo had called 911 to report that her boyfriend, Stefan Anderson, had just assaulted her.
I was pleading to please let me go, and he wouldn't.
Anna is hysterical. She's crying. She's sobbing. It's actually hard to even understand her.
And when the first officer on the scene reached the condo, it was clear that Anna had reason to be distraught.
When he gets there, Anna Trujillo opens the door, covered in blood.
But that was nothing compared to Stefan's condition.
At the end of the hallway, he can see Stefan Anderson laying there in a pool of blood.
The 59-year-old university professor wasn't moving, his head a bloody mess. And when the officer checks Stefan's vital signs,
he finds that Dr. Anderson has no pulse.
EMTs arrived on the scene moments later and confirmed that Stefan was dead. There was another surprise coming, though, because when the officer at the scene asked Anna where the weapon was,
he originally thought Dr. Anderson had actually been shot in the head.
Anna pointed to the high-heeled shoe on the floor next to Stefan's head.
Who knew you could use that as a murder weapon?
Stefan had been killed with a 5.5-inch stiletto.
You could see that it was bloody. You could see that there was hair wrapped around it.
While crime scene investigators began processing the condo, the police transported Anna downtown to take her statement, even as news crews began flocking to the scene.
Cameras are already starting to come to the Park Lane.
We all just heard this apparent crazed woman stab someone with her stiletto heel.
Escorted out of the Park Lane before the news crews could set up, the police brought Anna downtown for a formal statement. And once inside the interrogation room, Anna explained that her relationship with Stefan had started out well.
We went out, and it was positive, it was very good. He really liked me.
He actually texted me that he was crazy and in love.
And according to Anna, he meant it.
He asked me to move in, and he asked me to marry him.
Anna said that her first inclination was to say yes.
I like intelligence, he's respectable, and he treated me very good.
But she also said that she hesitated. According to Anna, Stefan's devotion had a dark side.
She said there was a lot more going on behind the scenes than what people saw.
For one thing, Anna said that Stefan was a lonely, lonely man.
Most of his family still lived in Sweden. His close friends really were still in Dallas.
And once they started dating, Anna said that Stefan's affection for her had become obsessive.
That was his everything.
And Anna said that Stefan refused to let anything or anyone infringe on their relationship.
She claimed that he was very jealous.
Everywhere, he just 24/7 on me.
But according to Anna, Stefan's drinking was the worst part.
He could not stop drinking.
He'd start drinking from about 9 o'clock in the morning till 6 at night.
And when he was drunk, Anna said that the mild-mannered professor became a very different man.
He started becoming abusive.
Like physically abusive, mentally abusive?
Mentally abusive. Ugly, yeah, to me.
Just by words and how he treated you?
And then the words he used, yes.
Although words had been enough, according to Anna. She told the investigators that at the beginning of 2013, she'd packed her bags to leave.
I said, you know what, I can't live like this.
Anna said she had left, heading down to Mexico for an extended vacation. But she also claimed that Stefan had contacted her regularly the entire time she was gone, begging her to come back.
I told him that I love him, that he's drinking too much, that he needed, to stop.
According to Anna, that's exactly what Stefan did. She said that by early in the summer of 2013, Stefan had sought treatment and kicked his drinking habit entirely.
He was looking good, gets a tan.
Anna told the investigators that Stefan had been doing so well that when he once again asked her to marry him at the beginning of June, she had said yes.
This is what I wanted this whole time, so we're happy and everything.
But that happiness wouldn't last. According to Anna, she and Stefan had gone out on the town the night before, partly to celebrate their pending engagement.
They went to 5015, which is an upscale bar here in Houston.
And despite his recent return to sobriety, Anna said that she noticed that Stefan was drinking. Not that she'd apparently thought much of it at the time.
We're having a nice time, and it was good.
But Anna said by the time they got home, Stefan wasn't just drunk. She said he'd become angry, too.
And they'd both been drinking, and, it's a volatile situation.
According to Anna, Stefan had accused her of flirting with other men at the bar.
I get jealous when you're talking to those guys.
Anna said that when Stefan started getting belligerent, she had decided to leave. But according to Anna, when she turned for the door, Stefan had flown into a rage.
He just came in towards me. He goes, you're not going to go anywhere. You're not going to leave me again, ever.
Anna said that Stefan had gotten between her and the door.
He wouldn't let her leave.
I'm like, please, please let me leave.
But according to Anna, the more she pleaded, the angrier Stefan had become.
He starts to get out of control, and he's yelling and he's put into a frenzy.
And when Anna bolted for the door,
he grabbed me, and he wouldn't let me go, and he started wrestling with me.
He got her into a very painful wrestling hold.
They said they fell over a couch, rolled off of the couch, struggled, went down the hall, struggled more.
He slammed her up against the wall.
Anna said she had fallen to the floor soon after, with Stefan on top of her.
I couldn't breathe, and I was suffocating. And I was like...
Dr. Anderson was hurting her tremendously, putting her in a lot of pain.
I was losing consciousness.
On the verge of blacking out, Anna said she had reached for the first thing she could find, her 5-inch stiletto heel.
She grabbed the shoe. That was the only thing that she could use as a weapon.
I was just hitting him with the shoe. Please stop, stop.
But she said that Stefan hadn't released her until it was too late.
And then that's when I saw the blood.
And it was only then, once he'd rolled off of her, that she'd realized just what she had done.
I felt sickened, like I saw him.
If what Anna said was true, Stefan's death was quite possibly justified.
This is domestic violence. It was a sudden passion case. She did what she had to do.
It had all the makings of a self-defense case.
But only if she was telling the truth. And with what promised to be a high-profile homicide on their hands, the Houston police decided to take Anna into custody until they could check out her story. By mid-morning on June 9th, 2013, Anna Trujillo sat in a holding cell at the Houston Police Department. The 44-year-old massage therapist had been taken into custody a few hours earlier after killing her boyfriend, Stefan Anderson.
Whenever a woman kills a man, the first question is, what did he do? There is this perception out there that because women generally are not as violent as men, that clearly he must have deserved it.
And that appeared to be true in Anna's case. Questioned by the police, she said that Stefan, a 59-year-old research scientist and college professor, had attacked her in a drunken rage.
He started hitting me, and I was telling him to please stop.
Anna said that she had fought back with the first weapon that came to hand, her 5-inch stiletto heel.
She started striking him with a shoe. It was the only thing available at the time.
She just did what she could to save herself.
And police were inclined to believe her.
Her story on the surface seemed very plausible.
The police did take her into custody while they verified her story, though. And the first step was having her strip off her bloody clothes so the police could document her injuries.
I photographed her from top to bottom, side to side, back.
But even before the photos were shot, Anna's story started to go awry.
Anna Trujillo suffered no injuries.
Anna Trujillo has not a mark on her, not a bruise, not a scratch, nothing.
It was a marked and extremely suspicious contrast to Stefan's injuries, which were massive.
Stefan Anderson was struck at least 25 times.
You could see definitive shapes of that heel mark right there on the head.
However, those weren't the only wounds the autopsy found, though.
He also had puncture wounds to the back and front of his forearms, and especially to the palms of his hands.
In other words, textbook defensive wounds.
We believe he put up his hands and arms to defend or protect his face.
Meanwhile, the crime scene investigators back at Stefan's condo had made some curious discoveries of their own concerning the blood spatter where Stefan had died.
The vast majority of the stains are all about 2 feet from the floor, very low to the ground.
Which suggested the exact opposite of Anna's story, that Stefan had been on top of her.
These blows were inflicted as Stefan Anderson was on his back.
And when the investigators examined the bloody clothes Anna had been wearing, they noticed something else.
Anna Trujillo had blood soaked in her crotch and in her thighs.
The defensive wounds, the blood spatter, and the bloodstains on her clothing all led the investigators to the same conclusion.
Every strike to Stefan Anderson was while he was laying down, and she was on top of him.
She was straddling him.
And if that was true, that meant Anna's entire account of Stefan's death was a lie.
Anna Trujillo did not act in self-defense.
However, when the investigators questioned the couple's friends, they confirmed at least part of Anna's story. Stefan had struggled with alcoholism, especially since moving to Houston a few years earlier.
He really didn't have a social network in place, and he did turn to drinking.
And Anna's claims that he was an angry, abusive drunk. Would his friends confirm that, too?
Anyone that knows him are 100% sure that there was no abuse from his side against her or towards her.
There was no information that said that Dr. Anderson had ever been violent with anybody, ever.
Stefan is this incredibly gentle man. Just incredibly gentle.
He would never even say a bad word to anyone.
And while Stefan's friends admitted that he was an alcoholic, they said that compared to the Chardonnay-sipping Stefan, Anna was far worse.
Ms. Trujillo had been arrested twice for driving while intoxicated.
And considering the circumstances surrounding one of those arrests, it was amazing she hadn't killed someone then.
She had been driving the wrong way down one of the major freeways.
Some people in life don't really handle alcohol well, and she was one of those people.
The result was a downward spiral.
Every time I would see her, it seemed like she was more disheveled, more intoxicated.
She was kicked out of bars for being publicly intoxicated.
And according to her friends, Anna wasn't just a drunk. she was a mean drunk.
If something set her off, there was no telling what she would do.
She just blurts nasty things out. She just suddenly attacks them.
And when it came to men, friends claimed that Anna's attacks would often turn physical.
We found several men that actually had instances of her biting or striking them in the face.
She hit a man over the head with a candlestick.
Needless to say, once Anna had hooked up with the shy, quiet Stefan, friends had figured it was a disaster waiting to happen.
The two of them together was a bad combination.
They kind of spiraled out of control when the two of them were together.
I think in some ways it sounded like a perfect storm.
Not only was Anna loud and domineering,
she was the one that was aggressive.
Stefan's mild manner did little to keep her worst tendencies in check.
He would never stand up for himself. He doesn't want anyone to be angry or upset.
He would rather not hurt somebody's feelings and suffer himself rather than make someone feel uncomfortable.
And according to his friends, Stefan had suffered.
I heard from friends of his that he had come with black eyes.
In fact, friends said that Anna had only been living with him for a few weeks before Stefan realized he had to end things with her.
She was a handful. She was too much.
Although even then, friends said that the mild-mannered scientist had, of course, hesitated.
He didn't really have it in him to throw someone out.
But at the beginning of 2013, his neighbors at the Park Lane had forced the issue.
The management at the Park Lane spoke to him about her and her presence in the apartment.
Other residents had actually complained about Anna Trujillo's behavior.
It was the last straw, friends said. Stefan had finally had enough.
By January or February of 2013, he wanted her out of his life.
And contrary to Anna's claims of an engagement, his friends said that 6 months into their relationship, he had kicked her out.
Changed his locks in his apartment.
Had her guest privileges revoked.
Although even then, Stefan hadn't made a clean break with Anna. Instead, he'd paid her way to Mexico.
He sent her to Mexico just to get her out of his hair.
With Anna gone, Stefan had started to move on.
He was happy again. There was no mentioning of ever getting back with her.
But was Anna as willing to walk away from Stefan? Friends said that once she returned from Mexico, Anna had a disturbing habit of turning up in the same upscale bars and restaurants Stefan frequented.
Stefan always had the same routine during the day, and she knew that routine.
He was easy to stalk.
And despite their recent breakup, friends said that Stefan went out of his way to be cordial to Anna.
Stefan was a really caring person.
He really wanted to help her.
In fact, Stefan even went so far as continuing to pay Anna's bar tab.
She basically lived off him even though she didn't live with him.
At least, not always. But according to friends, Stefan would still allow Anna to crash at his condo from time to time, whenever one of her other friends kicked her out.
Dr. Anderson seemed very torn. Anna Trujillo really had nowhere else to go.
I don't know that he's ever cut out any person out of his life.
But had Stefan's kindness and his unwillingness to assert himself ended up costing him his life? By the end of that Sunday, the authorities were convinced. Less than 24 hours after Stefan's death, they booked Anna Trujillo on murder charges. On March 31st, 2014, Anna Trujillo walked into a packed courtroom at Houston's Harris County Courthouse.
There were cameras and definitely lots of media attention in the courtroom.
The 45-year-old massage therapist was charged with the sensational murder of her ex-boyfriend, a 59-year-old scientist and university professor named Stefan Anderson.
The community interest was huge. Everyone was fascinated by this.
And given the weapon she had admitted using to kill Stefan, it was easy to see why.
The news that a woman had pummeled a man to death with her stiletto heel just took off like wildfire.
She was dubbed as the stiletto murderer.
Released on a $100,000 bond, Anna had spent the months before the trial telling anyone who would listen that she wasn't a murderer at all.
She had done several pretrial interviews trying to get her side or her story out there.
He attacked me and I defended myself.
Ana Trujillo's story was always self-defense.
The pain was so excruciating and I was in fear and all I had was my shoes.
But the prosecution wasn't buying it.
The physical evidence just didn't match what she was trying to say.
And in opening statements, the prosecutor said that contrary to her claims that Stefan was an abusive alcoholic, Anna was the real violent drunk in the relationship.
Her drinking usually ended in her becoming physically violent.
According to the state, June 9, 2013 had been no exception. The prosecution argued that when Stefan and Anna had returned to his condo after a night out drinking, something had set off Anna's notorious temper.
They came back, things got heated, and she just became out of control.
And at some point during her outburst, the prosecution believed that Anna had shoved her ex-boyfriend to the floor.
We know that Dr. Anderson had fallen down on his back. He's face up.
That's when, according to the prosecution, Anna had grabbed the murder weapon, her 5-inch stiletto heel.
She climbed on top of his chest and then repeatedly struck him.
It was basically like taking an ice pick to someone's face.
And the prosecutors claimed that even as she beat him to death, there was no evidence that the kind, gentle Stefan had tried to retaliate.
Even at the moment that Stefan Anderson is being beat to death, he refuses to hit a woman.
There was no reason for her to kill Stefan Anderson. This was not self-defense, this was murder.
And the prosecution felt they had the witnesses to prove it, too, including one who could attest to Anna's behavior on the night of Stefan's murder. On March 31st, 2014, prosecutors called a Houston cab driver named Rosemary Gomez to the stand. She testified that Stefan had called for a cab at about 1:30 a.m. on June 9th from the Museum District bar where he'd had dinner and drinks with Anna. But when Rosemary met Stefan outside the bar, Anna hadn't wanted to leave.
He asked me if I could wait a minute because he had to go get his lady friend.
Security footage from inside the bar appeared to back up Rosemary's story, too.
You see Ana Trujillo flirt with other men at the bar. You see her to continue to drink alcohol.
And it was only after several minutes with the meter running that Stefan finally managed to pry Anna away from her tequila.
You could tell she had way too much to drink.
Ana Trujillo was very aggressive, very angry, and belligerent.
And according to Rosemary, the cab ride that followed had seemed like an eternity.
Ana Trujillo cussed her out on the way home and got very, very angry and verbally abusive with her.
F this, F that, bitch this, bitch that. It was like 8 minutes of hell.
Stefan had tried to make the best of the situation.
He was very calm the whole time, very together, you know. He never cursed. He never said anything bad.
He was apologizing for her to the cab driver.
He was more embarrassed than anything else.
And when the taxi had finally arrived at Stefan's building, Rosemary said that Anna had refused to wait while he paid the fare.
She started telling me, let me out this cab.
She was jerking on the door and stuff, trying to open it up, you know, and kicking at the back seat.
Despite her haste, Rosemary testified that once out of the cab, Anna had stood on the sidewalk and continued to scream at Stefan.
She's very derogatory in the way that she speaks to Dr. Anderson.
Just went on, you know, like a drunk person, how they carry on.
In fact, Rosemary said she had been so disturbed by Anna's behavior that she had offered to drive Stefan somewhere, anywhere, to give Anna time to cool down.
I was concerned for his safety, and I let him know it. I said, Mr. Anderson, I really got a bad feeling that something's going to happen.
But according to Rosemary, Stefan had refused the offer.
He said, "You're a very kind lady." He said, "But thank you." He said, "I'll be fine."
And then, according to Rosemary, she had watched helplessly as Stefan turned around and followed Anna into the building.
The last image of Stefan Anderson alive is actually pretty heartbreaking. You can see him walking into the lobby of the Park Lane, and he just looks defeated.
And in a little more than an hour, he would be dead. But while the prosecution accused Anna of killing Stefan in a drunken rage, when it was the defense's turn, they reminded the court that she wasn't the only one that had been drinking that evening.
Dr. Anderson was an alcoholic.
And that was despite his recent stint in rehab.
He was in relapse, that he was probably worse than when he first quit drinking.
And the defense had the evidence to prove it, too. Stefan's blood alcohol level.
It was above the legal limit.
The defense said that the results overwhelmingly supported Anna's self-defense story.
An alcoholic can just go off the deep end in a split second.
You can't trust that he's in his right state of mind.
The defense claimed that in the summer of 2013, Stefan wasn't just in relapse. He was in a downward spiral.
Witnesses said he drank every day, that he would be intoxicated before noon.
He didn't do anything but drink.
According to the defense, Stefan had managed to hide his addiction from friends, family, and even coworkers, but not Anna. They claimed that she had suffered the full wrath of Stefan's drunken temper.
They tried to portray Stefan Anderson as an alcoholic who was aggressive and mean when he was intoxicated.
They tried to paint her as the poor woman who was stuck in this horrible relationship.
And the defense claimed that once alone in Stefan's condo that night, he had turned on her, furious at how she had embarrassed him on the ride home.
Anderson was the one fighting her, the one beating her up.
And the defense said that Anna had done the only thing she could have done, fight back.
I felt it was a very strong self-defense case.
In fact, the defense was so sure of their case that they wrapped it up without putting Anna on the stand.
She hit him 25 times because she did what she had to do. She did what any reasonable person would do.
Naturally, the prosecution strongly disagreed.
Anna Trujillo violently beat her intimate partner to death for no reason. That is what makes her so dangerous. There is nothing to stop her from doing it again.
Nothing but sending her to prison, that is.
Anything less than a life verdict is unacceptable.
On April 8, 2014, the jury in Houston, Texas announced it had reached a verdict in the trial of Anna Trujillo. The 45-year-old was charged with murdering her ex-boyfriend, Stefan Anderson, with a stiletto-heeled shoe.
From the get-go, this case garnered national attention because of the murder weapon.
Anna didn't deny killing Stefan.
She claimed that it was self-defense.
But when the verdict was read, the jury found her guilty of murder. Anna took the news surprisingly well.
She was very calm. She was very collected.
But she wasn't resigned to her fate. At her sentencing on April 10, 2014, she finally took the stand to make a statement. And she wasn't apologetic either.
She wasn't like scared or worried or nervous.
Instead, she all but demanded that the jury give her the minimum sentence.
As little as 5 years in prison.
And despite the fact that the jury had rejected her self-defense claim, she stuck to it.
She talked about some of the violence that she'd suffered.
She described how horrific the fight was, that she was just trying to use self-defense to keep herself alive.
In fact, she didn't just describe it. She went on and on about it for over 7 hours.
She was telling her whole life story.
She just kept on talking and talking and talking.
Anna and her attorney even went so far as to act out key moments of the alleged struggle in front of the jury.
It was Anna Trujillo's show.
But But would her last-minute plea, all 420 minutes of it, make any impression on the jury?
The jury sentenced her to life in prison.
She was so shocked.
And she began sobbing.
I think she expected to get off there easy.
For Stefan's friends and family, some of whom had traveled all the way from Sweden for the trial, the sentence brought some sense of closure.
Even if nothing can get him back again, we're happy that justice is served.
But it couldn't make up for the tragic death of a kind and gentle man.
He did not deserve what happened to him at all, in any way. He was a really good person, the best person ever. And she is either a really crazy person or a really evil person that could do something like that.
At first glance, this story sounds like something that should never have happened. A teenager bearing the Getty surname, representing unimaginable wealth, privilege, and influence, vanished into the darkness of a summer night in Italy. His grandfather was one of the world's richest men, a businessman with an almost legendary fortune in the 1950s and 1960s. To many, a family like the Gettys seemed untouchable. Their wealth conjured up a sense of security, power, and the ability to solve almost any problem with a signature on a check. Yet, on July 10th, 1973, those assumptions shattered. 16-year-old John Paul, Getty III, disappeared from Piazza Farnese in Rome. Hours later, panic spread throughout his family and the authorities. Soon after, the disappearance became one of the most notorious kidnappings of the 20th century. It would become a story not simply about organized crime or a huge ransom. It would become a story about family, trust, doubt, suffering, and the painful realization that even unlimited wealth has its limits. There are crimes that shock because of their brutality, and there are crimes that endure because they expose uncomfortable truths about human relationships. The kidnapping of John Paul Getty III belongs to the latter category. It forced the public to ask difficult questions. What is the value of a human life? Does extraordinary wealth create extraordinary responsibility? Can a family torn apart by distance, divorce, and conflicting beliefs unite in the face of unimaginable danger? These questions were not only asked in newspapers, but were also hotly debated at dinner tables. Across Europe and America, the answers were never simple. Initially, his disappearance didn't cause immediate panic in every corner of the Getty family. John Paul Getty III was known as a rebellious teenager. After his parents' divorce, he moved to Rome to live with his mother, Gail Harris Getty, and grew up as a young man whose lifestyle was a stark contrast to the disciplined image many associated with one of the world's wealthiest families. He immersed himself in the culture of the early 1970s. He spent time in nightclubs, associated with artists, participated in left-wing protests, occasionally modeled, painted, and even made jewelry to earn money. To some observers, he seemed less interested in luxury than in freedom. That reputation would have consequences when he disappeared. Instead of immediately accepting that he had become the victim of a violent crime, some initially questioned whether the abduction was staged. The primary possibility that the teenager had staged his disappearance to extort money from his wealthy relatives complicated the family's response and influenced the early stages of the crisis. Every hour that passed with questions about what had really happened was an hour in which suspicion overshadowed urgency. Meanwhile, somewhere far from Rome, the reality was far more terrifying. The young man had not disappeared voluntarily. He had been kidnapped by members of the Calabrian organized crime gang known as the 'Ndrangheta. Their objective was clear. They demanded $17 million for his freedom. The amount itself was enormous. But perhaps even more astonishing was the subsequent reaction. The central figure in that reaction was John Paul Getty III's grandfather, the oil billionaire J. Paul Getty, famous not only for his immense wealth, but also for his reputation for extreme frugality. He refused to pay the ransom immediately. His reasoning was blunt and uncompromising. If he paid the ransom for one grandson, he believed the other 13 would become targets for future kidnappings. Whether considered strategic calculation or cold indifference, this decision shocked public opinion. Newspapers around the world seized on the contrast between his immense wealth and his unwillingness to spend it to save a family member. As the days passed, the kidnapping transformed from a criminal investigation into an international tragedy watched by millions. Each development heightened public interest. Each delay deepened anxiety for the teenager whose fate remained unknown. Then, that moment dispelled almost all remaining doubts. Months after the kidnapping, a newspaper in Rome received a terrifying package. Inside were a lock of John Paul Getty III's hair and a severed ear, along with a threat that if the ransom payment was further delayed, more of his body parts would be taken. It was a brutal message intended not only to prove the kidnappers were holding the victim, but also to demonstrate their willingness to inflict irreparable harm. During his captivity, the wound became severely infected. John Paul Getty III also contracted pneumonia, and his health deteriorated significantly. The kidnapping was no longer a matter of speculation or distant negotiation. It had become an undeniable humanitarian crisis. Faced with irrefutable evidence of his nephew's suffering, J. Paul Getty eventually agreed to pay a portion of the ransom. He paid $2.2 million, an amount considered the maximum tax deductible under U.S. law at the time. The remainder was lent to his son at a 4% interest rate. Even after the teenager's release, the financial settlement remained one of the most controversial aspects of the case. Critics argued it reflected a willingness to calculate personal gain at a time when compassion was more important than anything else. Others worried that the unlimited ransom payment could encourage future kidnappings targeting members of wealthy families. Regardless of which side public opinion leaned, the debate ensured that the Getty kidnapping would never be remembered merely as a crime. It would be remembered as a family dispute that challenged conventional notions of love, responsibility, and duty. On December 15, 1973, after nearly 5 months in captivity, John Paul Getty III was finally released. He was found near a gas station near Lauria in southern Italy. Physically weakened and mentally wounded, he had survived an ordeal few could have imagined. According to his mother, he later tried to call his grandfather to express his gratitude for paying the ransom, which ultimately secured his freedom. His elderly grandfather, Getty, refused to answer the phone. That recorded moment remains one of the most haunting images associated with the case. It illustrates that even after freedom was restored, the emotional rift within the family remained painfully unresolved. However, his release did not mark the end of the investigation or the end of the suffering. Italian authorities arrested 9 suspects linked to the 'Ndrangheta terrorist organization, including high-ranking members such as Girolamo Piramali and Saverio Mammoliti. Despite this, only 2 were ultimately convicted. Many suspects were acquitted due to lack of evidence, and much of the ransom money was never recovered. For investigators, this case highlighted the immense challenges in prosecuting organized crime. However, for John Paul Getty III, the legal outcome could not erase the trauma caused by his captivity. In the years that followed, he underwent reconstructive surgery to repair his severed ear, but the psychological wounds were far harder to heal. Alcohol, drugs, and tranquilizers gradually became a part of his life. In 1981, at the age of 25, the combined use of alcohol, Valium, and methadone led to severe liver failure and stroke, leaving him quadriplegic with severely impaired speech and vision. and confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He lived for decades under constant care before dying in England on February 5, 2011, at the age of 54. His abduction later inspired many major dramatic works, including his attempt to call his grandfather to express gratitude for paying the ransom, which secured his release. The elderly Mr. Getty refused to answer the phone. That captured moment remains one of the most haunting images associated with the case. It shows that even after release, the emotional rift within the family remained painful and unresolved. However, his release did not mark the end of the investigation or the end of the suffering. Italian authorities arrested 9 suspects linked to the 'Ndrangheta, including high-ranking members such as Girolamo Piramali and Saverio Mammoliti. Despite these arrests, only 2 were ultimately convicted. Many suspects were acquitted due to lack of evidence, and much of the ransom money was never recovered. For investigators, the case demonstrated the immense challenges of prosecuting organized crime. However, for John Paul Getty III, the legal outcome could not erase the trauma caused by his captivity. In the years that followed, he underwent reconstructive surgery to repair his severed ear, but the psychological wounds were far harder to heal. Alcohol, drugs, and tranquilizers gradually became a part of his life. In 1981, at the age of 25, the combined use of alcohol, Valium, and methadone led to severe liver failure and a stroke, leaving him quadriplegic, with severely impaired speech and vision, and confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He lived for decades under constant care before dying in England on February 5, 2011, at the age of 54. His abduction later inspired many major theatrical works, including. He then tried to call his grandfather to express his gratitude for paying the ransom, which resulted in his release. The elderly Getty refused to answer the phone. That captured moment remains one of the most haunting images associated with the case. It showed that even after release, the emotional rift within the family remained painful and unresolved. However, release did not mark the end of the investigation or the end of the suffering. Italian authorities arrested 9 suspects linked to the 'Ndrangheta, including high-ranking members such as Girolamo Piramali and Saverio Mammoliti. Despite these arrests, only 2 were ultimately convicted. Many suspects were acquitted due to lack of evidence, and much of the ransom money was never recovered. For investigators, the case demonstrated the immense challenges in prosecuting organized crime. However, for John Paul Getty III, the legal outcome could not erase the trauma caused by his captivity. In the years that followed, he underwent reconstructive surgery to repair his severed ear, but the psychological wounds were far harder to heal. Alcohol, drugs, and tranquilizers gradually became a part of his life. In 1981, at the age of 25, the combined use of alcohol, Valium, and methadone led to severe liver failure and a stroke, leaving him quadriplegic, with severely impaired speech and vision, and confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He lived for decades under constant care before dying in England on February 5, 2011, at the age of 54. His abduction later inspired numerous major theatrical works, including. The use of methadone led to severe liver failure and a stroke, leaving him quadriplegic, with severely impaired speech and vision, and confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He lived for decades under constant care before dying in England on February 5, 2011, at the age of 54. His abduction later inspired several major television adaptations, including. The use of methadone led to severe liver failure and a stroke, leaving him quadriplegic, with severely impaired speech and vision, and confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He lived for decades under constant care before dying in England on February 5, 2011, at the age of 54. His abduction later inspired several major television adaptations, including. All the money in the world and all the trust have been used to ensure that future generations will continue to know this story. But behind each adaptation lies the true tragedy of a 16-year-old boy whose life was forever changed on a summer night in Rome. Throughout this episode, we will follow that true story step by step, based solely on documented events. We will learn who John Paul Getty III was before his disappearance, how the abduction unfolded, why the negotiations were so contentious, what investigators discovered afterward, and how those months affected the rest of his life. This is not simply the story of one of the most famous ransom cases in history. It is the story of how extraordinary wealth cannot prevent extraordinary suffering. And the ultimate price to pay is never measured in dollars. Before the headlines, the ransom letters, the international attention that made his name one of the most famous in modern criminal history, John Paul Getty III was simply a teenager trying to make his way in the shadow of one of the world's wealthiest families. His life began with extraordinary privilege, but privilege alone cannot define identity, nor can it guarantee happiness or security. Born Eugene Paul Getty II on November 4th, 1956, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, he joined a family whose fortune had become legendary. His grandfather, J. Paul Getty, considered one of the world's richest men in the 1950s and 1960s, had built a vast oil empire that made the Getty name synonymous with unimaginable wealth. To the outside world, being born into such a family seemed to guarantee a life of comfort, opportunity, and security. The public often envisioned immense wealth as a shield against instability, believing that money could solve almost any problem. However, the story of John Paul Getty III ultimately proved that financial power could not protect a family from emotional estrangement, tragedy, or violence. John Paul Getty III was the son of John Paul Getty Jr. and Gail Harris Getty. Like many other children, his childhood circumstances were shaped not only by his family's financial standing, but also by family relationships. When his parents divorced, a pivotal moment arrived. Instead of remaining in the United States, he moved to Rome with his mother. This shift took him away from the center of the Getty family's influence and introduced him to a social environment very different from what many might imagine for the grandson of an American billionaire. Rome in the late 1960s and early 1970s was a city of striking contrasts. It was a place where centuries of history coexisted with rapid cultural change. Traditional institutions stood alongside burgeoning youth movements, artistic experimentation, and political activism. For a teenager seeking independence, the city offered countless opportunities to explore different identities and communities. It was in this environment that John Paul Getty III spent much of his adolescence. Instead of embracing the glamorous image many expected of an heir to a vast fortune, he gravitated toward the culture of rebellion that had shaped much of his generation. He embraced a hippie lifestyle, reflecting values and interests that were in stark contrast to public expectations of someone bearing the Getty surname. Instead of living a secluded life behind walls of privilege, he became a familiar figure in Rome's social and artistic circles. He frequented nightclubs, where young people gathered to escape social norms and immerse themselves in music, conversation, and creative expression. These venues were not merely places of entertainment. They symbolized a generation eager to question existing power and redefine individual freedom. His interests were not limited to nightlife. He also participated in left-wing protests, another reflection of the turbulent political atmosphere of the time. Across Europe in the early 1970s, youth political participation was increasingly evident, and Rome was no exception. For John Paul Getty III, participating in such protests placed him among his peers who were questioning existing social and political structures. Whether driven by belief, curiosity, or simply a desire to fit in, These activities became part of the public image surrounding him. They also contributed to perceptions that would later influence the response to his disappearance. Unlike the stereotypical image of a wealthy heir solely dependent on his inheritance, he also pursued creative work. According to available information, he worked as a model, painter, and jewelry maker to earn a living. These activities show a young man interested in artistic expression and personal independence. Although Getty's fortune was vast, his daily life reflected interests that transcended luxury or business. His modeling career introduced him to Rome's creative community, while painting and jewelry making allowed him to develop his artistic skills and interact with people whose lives were vastly different from those of the international financial world. These activities also solidified his connections with artists and other members of the city's liberal arts scene. To outsiders, he appeared more like an adventurous teenager eager to explore the possibilities of youth than a future business executive. However, public perception can be a double-edged sword. The very lifestyle that made John Paul Getty III seem unconventional also created assumptions about his personality. Information about his interest in nightlife, political protests, art, and liberal social groups shaped how others perceived him. These perceptions then became incredibly important after his disappearance. Instead of immediately concluding that he had become the victim of a serious crime, some questioned whether his disappearance was voluntary. The idea that he may have staged his own kidnapping for financial gain emerged in the early stages of the investigation. It is important to emphasize that this was still only an initial suspicion, not an established fact. However, the existence of such suspicion delayed the urgency with which some reacted to the ransom demand. The possibility that the disappearance was a staged act further complicated an already difficult situation. In retrospect, this moment shows how reputation can influence the interpretation of events long before evidence is available. A person's lifestyle, friendships, and public image can shape assumptions, which may be accurate or entirely false. In the case of John Paul Getty III, his unconventional teenage years were partly why the reality of his circumstances wasn't immediately apparent. The contrast between appearance and reality became one of the most striking themes of the case. To many outsiders, he appeared to be a spoiled teenager experimenting with freedom. Few could have imagined that he would soon become the victim of one of the most infamous kidnappings of the 20th century. The Getty family itself occupied a unique place in the public imagination. The enormous fortune that J. Paul Getty had amassed attracted admiration, curiosity, and criticism of equal measure. Newspapers regularly reported on the family's wealth, business dealings, and lifestyle. As a result, the Getty name had become internationally famous long before the kidnapping occurred. This level of fame carried unavoidable risks. Organized crime groups understand that famous families are potential targets for ransom. The combination of global fame and financial resources is thought to create an incentive few ordinary families can match. However, fame also creates another consequence. Every personal event involving the Getty family has the potential to become international news. When tragedy finally struck, millions followed every development, transforming a private family crisis into a public spectacle. Yet for John Paul Getty III himself, life before his abduction was that of a 16-year-old teenager going through puberty. He grew up between two cultures, balancing the expectations associated with one of the world's most famous families with a desire to assert his individuality. His artistic interests, friendships, and involvement in youth culture reflect a person seeking experiences beyond the boundaries of inherited wealth. Whether painting, making jewelry, modeling, frequenting nightclubs, or participating in protests, he seemed determined to forge an identity of his own, not merely inherit one shaped by previous generations. There is a certain irony to this period of his life. While the name Getty opened countless doors, it also ensured he could never completely escape public expectations. Every decision was viewed through the lens of extraordinary wealth. Actions that seemed normal for an unusual teenager became noteworthy simply because he was a member of the Getty family. Even his attempts to make money through creative work attracted attention precisely because observers knew of the immense fortune tied to his family. The tension between personal identity and inherited fame remained an invisible force pervading his life. It would become clear and painful when the kidnapping occurred. The public would quickly realize that even the grandson of one of history's richest men was not immune to vulnerability. In fact, his family name likely made him more vulnerable than most. In the summer of 1973, nothing was publicly revealed to suggest that just days later, his life would change forever. Rome remained the setting for his daily life, his friendships, and his artistic pursuits. The Getty family continued to thrive under international scrutiny, while the teenager himself sat somewhere between privilege and rebellion. However, beneath that normalcy, danger loomed. Unbeknownst to John Paul Getty III, individuals connected to organized crime recognized him not as a young artist or a risk-taker, but as the grandson of a billionaire whose family fortune represented an extraordinary opportunity. In the eyes of those criminals, his personal interests, friendships, and ambitions meant nothing. What mattered was the name he bore and the fortune they believed lay behind it. In just a few hours, that realization would change his life completely. A night in Rome would abruptly end the relative freedom of his adolescence and begin a nightmare that would draw the attention of the entire world. The summer of 1973 showed no signs that John Paul Getty III was about to become the victim of one of the most infamous kidnappings in modern history. Just 16 years old, he lived in Rome with his mother after his parents' divorce, immersed in the city's rebellious arts and youth culture. Like many teenagers, he spent his evenings with friends and enjoyed the freedoms of adolescence. However, unlike most young people, he bore one of the world's most famous family names. To organized crime, that name represented something far more valuable than personal identity. It represented access to vast fortune. At dawn on July 10th, 1973, around 3 o'clock in the morning, that realization changed his life forever. While in Piazza Farnese in Rome, John Paul Getty III was abducted. The attack occurred swiftly, marking the beginning of a nearly 5-month-long ordeal. Initially, very little information was publicly available about what had happened. Only one undeniable fact remained. The 16-year-old nephew of billionaire J. Paul Getty had disappeared. For his family, bewilderment mingled with fear. For investigators, each passing hour increased the urgency of determining whether the disappearance was voluntary or the result of a serious crime. Due to John Paul Getty III's unconventional lifestyle, the initial assumptions surrounding the case were far from straightforward. He was known as a rebellious teenager, involved in the hippie movement, frequenting nightclubs, associating with artists, participating in left-wing protests, and seeking creative independence through modeling, painting, and jewelry making. These aspects of his life influenced how some people interpreted his disappearance. Instead of immediately concluding that he had been kidnapped, there were initial suspicions that he may have staged the event to extort money from his extremely wealthy family. These suspicions were not based on evidence, but on perception, and they complicated the family's response during this crucial early stage. Every delay in accepting the kidnapping as real meant more time without progress in negotiations. While uncertainty persisted in Rome, the reality unfolding elsewhere was far more alarming. John Paul Getty III did not stage his disappearance. He was abducted by members of the Calabrian organized crime group, known as the 'Ndrangheta, The abduction was meticulously planned and financially motivated. After kidnapping the teenager, they took him hundreds of kilometers from Rome to a remote cave in the Calabrian mountains of southern Italy. Hidden from public view and isolated from any possibility of escape, the 16-year-old boy entered a period of captivity marked by increasing anxiety, physical hardship, and despair. The kidnappers' objective quickly became clear. They demanded a ransom of $17 million for his release. At the time, this was an astonishing sum. It not only reflected the criminals' awareness of the Getty family's immense wealth, but also their confidence that this fortune could eventually be converted into cash. Globally, this demand immediately attracted attention. The kidnapping was no longer merely an Italian criminal investigation. It had become an international story involving one of the world's wealthiest families. However, the Getty family's response was far more complex than the kidnappers anticipated. At the heart of the negotiations was John Paul, Getty III's grandfather, J. Paul Getty, renowned for his extraordinary financial discipline. Instead of immediately agreeing to the ransom demand, he refused to pay. His explanation was clear and consistent. If he paid to secure the release of one grandson, he believed the remaining 13 would become attractive targets for future kidnappers. In his view, yielding to the ransom would encourage further crimes against his family, whether interpreted as strategic thinking or emotional detachment. This decision quickly became one of the defining features of the entire case. Public reaction was swift and deeply divided. Many found it difficult to understand how one of the world's richest men could refuse to meet the kidnapper's demands while his grandson remained captive. Others recognized the broader concern that paying a huge ransom could encourage organized crime, groups to repeat similar kidnappings. Regardless of personal opinion, that refusal significantly altered the course of events. The kidnappers expected money to bring about a quick payment. Instead, negotiations stalled and weeks turned into months. During this time, John Paul Getty III remained imprisoned in the remote cave where his captors held him. According to available information, the conditions of his captivity gradually deteriorated his health. Cut off from his family and uncertain whether rescue or negotiations could guarantee his freedom, he endured prolonged captivity while the ransom dispute continued in a distant location. As time passed, the kidnappers faced their own problems. Their demands did not yield the expected payment. They needed to convince the Getty family that the teenager was indeed in their custody, and they were prepared to carry out increasingly violent threats. In November 1973, the case reached its most horrific turning point. A newspaper in Rome received a package containing a lock of John Paul Getty III's hair and a severed ear. The package included a warning that if the ransom continued to be withheld, other body parts would be sent. The message was unmistakable. This act was orchestrated to dispel any remaining doubts that the abduction might be a hoax, and to demonstrate that the criminals were willing to inflict irreparable physical harm. The brutality of this act altered public perception of the case. What had previously been shrouded in uncertainty now became undeniable. The teenager's suffering was real, immediate, and worsening. The physical consequences of the injury were not limited to the amputation. According to reports, the Wound became severely infected during his captivity. He also developed pneumonia, further deteriorating his health. Each passing day increased the danger to his life. The kidnapping transformed from financial negotiation into a race against time. Evidence sent to Rome forced the Getty family to confront the reality that continued delay would lead to irreversible tragedy. Faced with irrefutable evidence that his nephew's life was in grave danger, J. Paul Getty ultimately changed his stance. He agreed to provide $2.2 million in ransom, an amount believed to be the maximum deductible under U.S. tax law at the time. The remaining funds were not only given to him, but also lent to his son at a 4% interest. rate. This financial arrangement became almost as famous as the kidnapping itself. For many observers, it symbolized the extraordinary complexity of the Getty family's response, even while acting to secure his nephew's release. Paul Getty maintained the financial discipline for which he had long been known. This agreement sparked widespread criticism and remained one of the most discussed aspects of the case decades later. Finally, after nearly 5 months of captivity, negotiations reached a goal. On December 15, 1973, John Paul Getty III was released. He was found near a gas station near Lauria in southern Italy. Despite his freedom, he emerged from prison in a weakened state after months of confinement, suffering from injuries, infections, and illnesses. The nightmare that began in Rome on the morning of July 10th had finally ended, but its consequences were only just beginning to unfold. One of the most touching moments after his release was his attempt to express gratitude. According to John Paul Getty III's mother, he called his grandfather to thank him for paying the ransom, which had secured his freedom. The elderly Getty refused to take the phone. Whether viewed as consistency, emotional distance, or something more complex, the recorded decision remains one of the most haunting events related to the abduction. It shows that even after the immediate crisis ends, unresolved tensions within the family continue to exist. Freedom cannot compensate for what was lost during the months of captivity. Physical wounds can be healed, but the emotional trauma will last far longer. The abduction is over, but the hunt for those responsible has only just begun. Italian authorities now face the daunting task of identifying, arresting, and prosecuting the individuals behind one of the most notorious crimes in the country's modern history. Investigators will soon discover that confronting organized crime is far more complex than securing the victim's release, and achieving justice will be almost as difficult as ending the abduction. The release of John Paul Getty III on December 15, 1973, marked the end of nearly 5 months of captivity, but also the beginning of another long and difficult chapter. For investigators, securing the victim's freedom was never the ultimate goal. The greater challenge now lay in identifying each individual responsible for planning, executing, and profiting from one of the most notorious kidnappings of the 20th century. The case attracted worldwide attention, putting immense pressure on Italian authorities to demonstrate that organized crime groups could be investigated and prosecuted under the law. Almost immediately, however, it became clear that solving the case would be far more complex than simply bringing the victim home. Unlike crimes committed by single individuals, this kidnapping involved members of a Calabrian organized crime group known as the 'Ndrangheta. Organized crime networks operate through multiple layers of loyalty, secrecy, and shared interests, making it difficult for investigators to pinpoint exactly who was involved in each stage of the crime. Even after the victim is released, many of the most crucial questions remain unanswered. Who planned the kidnapping? Who abducted John Paul Getty III from Piazza Farnese? Who guarded him during his months of captivity in the remote Calabria cave? Who transferred the ransom money? And, perhaps most importantly, who ultimately benefited from the enormous sum that secured his freedom? Investigators understand that answering these questions requires more careful evidence gathering than relying on assumptions. Public opinion often demands immediate certainty after a widely publicized case, but criminal investigations rarely proceed so swiftly. Each arrest must be supported by evidence capable of overcoming court scrutiny. Each accusation must ultimately be substantiated in court. In a case involving organized crime, that process is even more difficult because criminal organizations are structured to conceal individual responsibility. The secrecy surrounding the 'Ndrangheta presented investigators with insurmountable obstacles simply because the crimes had become internationally notorious. Nevertheless, Italian authorities continued their investigation. Their efforts eventually led to the arrest of 9 suspects believed to be involved in the kidnapping. Among those arrested were Girolamo Piramali and Saverio Mammoliti, individuals identified as members of the 'Ndrangheta. These arrests marked a crucial stage in the investigation as they showed authorities had succeeded in identifying individuals believed to be connected to the criminal organization responsible for the kidnapping of John Paul Getty III. However, arrests did not automatically equate to conviction. In any criminal justice system governed by law, investigators must produce sufficient evidence to prove guilt beyond the legal standards required by the court. Public belief cannot substitute for evidence. International attention cannot replace legally accepted evidence. The Getty kidnapping illustrated this principle remarkably clearly. Although 9 suspects were apprehended, the available evidence ultimately did not lead to the conviction of all of them. This outcome disappointed many observers who expected the seriousness of the crime to result in severe penalties. Instead, investigators faced the familiar challenge of distinguishing between suspicion and evidence. Organized crime cases often involve multiple participants performing different roles, making it difficult to precisely determine the extent of individual responsibility. Some suspects may have known about the crime without directly participating in it. Others may have been involved in limited ways that are difficult to prove after the event occurred. The court required evidence linking each defendant to the specific crime. And if that evidence was insufficient, acquittal would become the legal consequence regardless of public opinion. Another primary goal of the investigation was to recover the ransom money. Initially, $17 million was demanded, and negotiations eventually led to the payment to secure the release of John Paul Getty III. Investigators naturally sought to determine where that money went. Recovering ransom money can achieve several important goals. It deprives criminal organizations of financial benefits, provides valuable evidence linking individuals to crimes, and may expose larger criminal networks. However, in this case, that goal was only partially achieved. According to available information, the vast majority of the ransom money was never recovered. The disappearance of that money was not merely a financial loss. It also highlighted the real difficulties investigators face when confronting organized crime groups, which are capable of concealing both people and money. Once financial assets disappear into criminal networks, tracing them becomes incredibly difficult, especially when multiple people are involved and relationships are complex. As the investigation progressed, another reality became increasingly clear. Although the kidnapping was over, its consequences continued to shape every aspect of the legal process. John Paul Getty III survived months of captivity, suffering physical injuries, infections, and illnesses. His release allowed investigators to confirm many essential facts about the crime. But the investigation could never erase what had happened. Criminal investigations seek accountability rather than recovery. They tried to identify the perpetrators and present evidence in court. But they couldn't bring the victims back to the lives they had lived before the crime occurred. This distinction became particularly important in the Getty case because the physical and psychological trauma inflicted during captivity was irreversible. Investigators could pursue justice, but they couldn't erase the suffering that had taken place in the remote Calabria cave. Public attention remained extremely high throughout the investigation. Newspapers continued to follow every development, reflecting the particular international interest generated by the combination of organized crime, vast wealth, and family disputes. However, investigators couldn't let public opinion dictate their conclusions. High-profile cases often create immense pressure for quick results. But responsible criminal investigations depend on evidence, not sensational headlines. Every arrest, every interrogation, every document, and every indictment undergoes a rigorous legal review process. Therefore, the investigation progresses based on available evidence, not on public expectations. This cautious approach explains why the final trial outcome differed from many predictions. Although authorities apprehended numerous suspects, the subsequent legal process determined that the evidence was sufficient to convict only a limited number of defendants. For many who followed the case, this outcome seemed unsatisfactory. The case involved months of captivity, international ransom negotiations, severe physical violence, and global attention. Naturally, expectations of comprehensive accountability arose. However, the criminal court did not judge the case based on public outrage, but on evidence. Thus, the Getty investigation became an illustration of both the strengths and weaknesses of the justice system. Authorities successfully identified and apprehended individuals connected to the organized crime group believed to be responsible for the kidnapping, but proving all charges against all suspects proved far more difficult. Throughout the investigation, one truth remained undeniable. The kidnapping fundamentally altered John Paul Getty III's life. All investigative developments unfolded while the victim was only just beginning his physical recovery. While investigators reviewed evidence and prosecutors prepared legal proceedings, the teenager himself faced the far greater personal challenge of overcoming the consequences of nearly 5 months of captivity. His release ended the immediate crisis, but the recovery process would take longer than any criminal investigation. The contrast between these two parallel journeys, the pursuit of legal responsibility and the victim's struggle to rebuild his life, will remain one of the defining features of the entire case. Ultimately, the investigation gathered enough evidence to bring the case to court, where judges would assess the allegations against the defendant and determine who could be held legally responsible. It is there, under the standards of criminal law and not under the pressure of public opinion, that the final chapter of the proceedings will take place. The investigation into the abduction of John Paul Getty III had captivated the world long before the first court hearings began. By the time prosecutors prepared to present the case, it had become one of the most widely discussed abductions of the 20th century. Newspapers followed every stage of the case, from the disappearance of the 16-year-old boy in Rome to the divisive ransom negotiations and the victim's repatriation after nearly 5 months of captivity. However, the transition from investigation to trial marked a significant shift. Public debate, emotional reactions, and media speculation no longer determine the outcome. Inside the courtroom, only evidence, legal standards, and the burden of proof would decide whether those accused of involvement in the abduction could be held criminally liable. For many observers, expectations were high. The kidnapping involved an internationally renowned family, a huge ransom, months of captivity, severe physical violence, and extensive police investigation. The public naturally expected those responsible to face appropriate punishment. However, the criminal justice system does not operate according to public expectations. Courts exist to determine legal responsibility, not to please public opinion. Each defendant enters the courtroom on the assumption of innocence, and prosecutors are responsible for proving guilt through sufficient evidence. This principle is particularly important in complex organized crime cases, where criminal activities are often divided among multiple participants whose individual roles are difficult to determine definitively. The kidnapping of John Paul Getty III accurately illustrated how difficult this process is. Italian authorities arrested 9 suspects during the investigation. Among them were Girolamo Piramali and Saverio Mammoliti, individuals identified as members of the Calabrian organized crime group known as the 'Ndrangheta. Their arrests reflected investigators' conclusions that organized crime played a central role in planning and executing the kidnapping. However, The arrests were only the beginning of legal proceedings. The legal system requires each charge to be supported by valid evidence capable of proving the individual's involvement in the crime. When prosecutors presented their case, the court considered whether the existing evidence established responsibility according to the legal standards necessary for conviction. The distinction between suspicion and evidence is becoming increasingly important. Investigators may reasonably suspect that multiple individuals were involved in a crime, especially a crime involving an organized crime network. However, criminal conviction requires more than mere suspicion. The involvement of each defendant must be proven with compelling evidence in court. In cases involving organized crime, this task is often particularly difficult because criminal organizations deliberately conceal their internal structure and individual responsibilities. Members may only know part of the overall plan. Different individuals may perform different tasks without direct knowledge of every aspect of the operation. These characteristics complicate efforts to link every suspect to every crime. The trial outcome reflects these difficulties. Of the 9 suspects apprehended during the investigation, only 2 were ultimately convicted. Many of the remaining defendants were acquitted due to insufficient evidence to prove their guilt. Under current legal standards, for the families involved and much of the public, this outcome is deeply disappointing. The scale of the crime led many to expect broader accountability. Instead, the court demonstrated a fundamental characteristic of the justice system. Criminal punishment can only be applied when there is evidence proving responsibility. An acquittal doesn't necessarily resolve all questions surrounding a crime, but it reflects the legal principle that guilt cannot be presumed without sufficient evidence. This outcome highlighted both the achievements and limitations of the proceedings. On the one hand, investigators successfully identified organized crime as the force behind the kidnapping and brought suspects to trial. On the other hand, not everyone involved can be held legally accountable based on the available evidence. Another unresolved issue concerns the ransom. Although negotiations ultimately secured the release of John Paul Getty III, the majority of the ransom money remains unaccounted for. This fact remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire case. The recovery of ransom money can strengthen criminal prosecutions by linking suspects to financial transactions and proving direct involvement in the crime. However, in this investigation, the inability to recover the majority of the money illustrated the difficulties authorities face when confronting organized crime networks capable of concealing financial assets. The disappearance of that money is another reminder that successful prosecution does not always eliminate all the consequences of a crime. Even after the 2 defendants were convicted, crucial questions remained unanswered, and significant parts of the criminal operation escaped complete legal resolution. Throughout the proceedings, public discussion went far beyond the issue of the defendant's guilt or innocence. The Getty family's conduct in the ransom negotiations was equally controversial. Paul Getty's refusal to pay immediately sparked intense criticism worldwide. His explanation, that paying a ransom for one grandson would put his 13 other grandchildren in greater danger by encouraging future kidnappings, continued to divide public opinion. Some viewed his stance as a reasonable attempt to prevent organized crime from targeting his family. Again, others believed that the immediate safety of his grandson should take precedence over any financial or strategic considerations. The revelation that he ultimately contributed only a portion of the ransom and lent the remainder to his son at a 4% interest rate became one of the most widely discussed aspects of the case. While these financial decisions were not matters for which the criminal court had jurisdiction, they significantly influenced public perception of the Getty family's response. The court focused on criminal responsibility, while society continued to debate moral responsibility. These 2 debates often ran concurrently but addressed very different questions. The legal system asked whether the defendants were guilty. The public asked whether every member of the Getty family had responded appropriately to the crisis. The answers to these questions were not necessarily the same. For John Paul Getty III himself, the trial's conclusion could not compensate for the months that had been stolen from him. Legal procedures exist to determine responsibility, not to erase the damage. No matter how many sentences were handed down, the physical and mental consequences of captivity remained. Ears were cut off, serious infections, pneumonia, and prolonged isolation were realities that no judicial ruling could reverse. Justice, even when served, rarely restored to victims the life they had enjoyed before the crime occurred. This reality became particularly evident in the Getty case because the most profound consequences extended far beyond the courtroom. The legal process had reached a conclusion, but the victim's recovery was only just beginning. In many high-profile criminal cases, public attention waned after the verdicts were announced. The Getty abduction proved the opposite. The unique combination of organized crime, enormous wealth, international attention, and family intrigue ensured that discussion continued long after the judicial proceedings concluded. The limited number of convictions became part of the case's lasting legacy. For some observers, it reflected the inherent difficulties in prosecuting organized crime organizations whose structures are deliberately designed to be difficult for investigators. For others, it illustrated the fact that even one of the most famous criminal investigations in modern history was bound by the same legal principles that govern all criminal prosecutions. Evidence, not public attention, determined the outcome. In that respect, the case became an example of the rule of law operating under close public scrutiny. When the final verdicts were delivered, the criminal proceedings gradually came to an end. 2 defendants were convicted. Many others were acquitted due to lack of evidence. And much of the ransom money vanished from the investigators' hands. The legal chapter closed, but the story was not over. The greatest consequences of the kidnapping would not be measured by the verdicts or prison sentences. They would be measured by the years that followed in the life of John Paul Getty III himself. A teenager taken hostage at 16 will carry the physical and psychological effects of such an ordeal into adulthood. And those consequences will ultimately shape the rest of his life more profoundly than any court ruling. The conclusion of a criminal case is often confused with the end of a story. The court delivers its verdict, investigators close the case, the press moves on to new headlines, and public attention shifts elsewhere. However, for victims, the end of legal proceedings rarely signals the end of suffering. In the case of John Paul Getty III, the kidnapping officially ended on December 15, 1973. When he was released after nearly 5 months of captivity near Lauria in southern Italy. The investigation ultimately led to his arrest. The court delivered its verdict, and the world shifted its attention to other events. But for the 16-year-old who endured months of isolation, physical violence, and insecurity, the consequences would last a lifetime. His story after the kidnapping is a reminder that survival does not always equate to recovery. Freedom ended captivity, but it did not erase the trauma. The damage inflicted during those months went far beyond the visible wound of losing an ear. Although his physical condition gradually stabilized after his release, the emotional and psychological effects of that experience continued to shape every stage of his adult life. In 1977, 4 years after the abduction, John Paul Getty III underwent reconstructive surgery to repair his severed ear. This surgery was a crucial step in addressing one of the most visible traces of the crime. Reconstructive surgery can restore appearance and, in some cases, improve physical function, but it cannot erase the memory. Every victim of violent crime carries experiences that no medical procedure can completely heal. For John Paul Getty III, the ear reconstruction symbolized both survival and permanence. The physical wounds may be treatable, but it will always be linked to one of the most infamous kidnappings in modern history. While surgery addresses the tangible consequences of the crime, the intangible ones are far harder to overcome. According to documented information, the years following the kidnapping were marked by struggles with alcohol, drug addiction, and dependence on tranquilizers. These developments illustrate the lasting burden that traumatic experiences can place on survivors. Trauma doesn't always manifest immediately, nor does it affect every individual in the same way. For some, psychological consequences emerge gradually, impacting relationships, decision-making, and overall health for years. The available information doesn't allow us to identify every individual factor contributing to John Paul Getty III's later difficulties, and it would be inappropriate to speculate beyond documented evidence. What can be said with certainty is that the abduction remained one of the defining events of his life, and his subsequent hardships followed months of captivity, enduring serious physical injuries, infections, and illnesses. Despite these challenges, life continued in some respects. In 1974, a year after his release, John Paul Getty III married Gisela Martine Zacher. They had a son, Balthazar Getty. These milestones show that even after such terrible trauma, life doesn't simply stop. Families continue to form, children are born, and new responsibilities arise. However, the existence of moments of happiness does not erase the impact of previous suffering. Human life is rarely divided into clearly defined chapters of happiness and tragedy. Often, both coexist simultaneously, with hope and hardship intertwined. The Getty family story after the abduction reflects this complexity. While a new generation joined the family with the birth of Balthazar Getty, the lasting impact of the abduction continued to shape his father's life. The most devastating chapter in John Paul Getty III's later life came in 1981. At age 25, he simultaneously used alcohol, the tranquilizer Valium, and methadone. According to records, this combination led to severe liver failure and a stroke. The consequences were catastrophic. He was quadriplegic, nearly lost his ability to speak, his eyesight deteriorated significantly, and he became dependent on a wheelchair and constant care for the rest of his life. It was a profound turning point, altering not only his physical condition, but every aspect of his daily life. The young man who had explored the art community in Rome, frequented nightclubs, painted, modeled, and sought creative independence, now faced life with severe physical limitations. The contrast between his youth and later circumstances remains one of the most poignant aspects of the entire story. Although the abduction ended many years ago, its place in the broader narrative of his life becomes inescapable. The years following the stroke were defined more by survival than recovery. John Paul Getty III required extensive support in his daily life and suffered from poor health for decades. Public attention to the Getty abduction occasionally returns through documentaries, articles, and discussions of organized crime or wealthy families. But the individual at the center of the story lives largely outside of those public conversations. His life continues quietly, shaped by circumstances vastly different from the freedom he enjoyed as a teenager in Rome. On February 5, 2011, John Paul Getty III died in England at the age of 54 after years of living with serious disabilities. His death closed the final chapter of a life known internationally not for personal ambition or professional achievements, but for a crime committed against him when he was just 16 years old. Looking back over the decades, it is clear that the abduction cannot be understood solely through the dramatic events of 1973. The months of captivity were only the beginning of a much longer story. Its consequences lasted for nearly 4 decades, affecting health, relationships, and quality of life in ways that no ransom or court ruling could fully resolve. The legacy of the case extends beyond the individuals directly involved. Over time, the abduction became part of popular culture, introducing new generations to the extraordinary events surrounding the Getty family. The 2017 film All the Money in the World, directed by Ridley Scott, recreated the ransom negotiations and the difficult decisions surrounding the case. In 2018, the television series Trust premiered. These works delved deeper into the Getty family and the kidnapping. They contributed to rekindling public interest, ensuring the case remains widely discussed decades after the crime occurred. However, it is important to distinguish between dramatization and documented history. Films and television series are created for audiences and may emphasize specific viewpoints or storytelling techniques. Documented events remain the foundation upon which historical understanding of the case is based. Those events reveal a tragedy that needs no embellishment. A 16-year-old boy was abducted by members of the Ndrangheta, held captive for nearly 5 months in a remote cave, subjected to brutal abuse, including the amputation of an ear, only released after protracted ransom negotiations, and left to suffer the consequences for the rest of his life. This story is powerful because it is true. It also challenges some of society's most ingrained assumptions. Wealth is often envisioned as the ultimate form of security, capable of preventing misfortune or quickly resolving crises. The Getty abduction proved the opposite. The immense fortune tied to one of the world's richest families could not prevent organized crime from choosing a vulnerable victim. It could not erase the family's disagreements about how to respond. The legal system could not save a 16-year-old from months of captivity, physical injury, or mental trauma, nor could it guarantee full justice through the legal system. And it cannot erase the lifelong consequences that haunt the victim long after international attention has subsided. This case also illustrates the horrific human cost of kidnapping. Public discussion often focuses on the ransom, negotiations, police investigations, and the trial outcome. But at the core of every kidnapping is an individual whose life has been profoundly disrupted. John Paul Getty III was not just a member of a prominent family. He was a teenager with artistic interests, personal ambitions, friendships, and the everyday uncertainties of adolescence. These aspects of his identity are sometimes obscured by the unique circumstances of the crime itself. Remembering the victim as a human being, not just a symbol, helps preserve the essential human dimension of the story. His experience reminds us that behind every newspaper headline is an individual whose suffering cannot be measured by the amount of media coverage or financial figures. Even the famous image of the Getty ransom often encourages discussion more about money than about the young man whose freedom depended on it. However, history ultimately shows that the greatest loss was not financial. $17 million in ransom was demanded. Millions of dollars were eventually paid. The vast majority of the ransom was never recovered. Those figures have become permanent markers in history. But the true cost of the abduction cannot be measured in money. Instead, it lies in 5 months of captivity, a permanent physical injury, years of psychological struggle, severe disability following the 1981 health crisis, and a life forever divided into 2 separate parts, before the abduction and afterward. More than half a century has passed since that summer night in Rome when John Paul Getty III disappeared from Piazza Farnese. The city streets continue to welcome visitors. The Getty name remains synonymous with extraordinary wealth and cultural philanthropy, and the legal proceedings have long since become history. Yet the abduction continues to be studied because it represents more than just a notorious criminal case. It is a cautionary reminder that organized crime can reach even the most powerful families. That public perception can complicate the search for truth. That justice often faces unavoidable limitations. And that the most profound consequences of violence often linger long after the headlines fade. Above all, the story of John Paul Getty III is a story of human vulnerability. The incident reminds us that privilege cannot erase suffering, that survival does not always restore what has been lost, and that the wounds inflicted by violent crimes often persist long after the victim regains their freedom. The kidnapping officially ended in December 1973, but its consequences continued to haunt John Paul Getty III until his death in 2011. This enduring reality, more than the Getty family's fortune or the notoriety of the ransom, explains why the case continues to resonate for generations. It is remembered not only for the money involved, but also for the lasting human cost that no amount of wealth can erase. Survival does not always compensate for loss, and the wounds inflicted by violent crimes often linger long after victims regain their freedom. The kidnapping officially ended in December 1973, but its consequences continued to haunt John Paul Getty III until his death in 2011. This enduring reality, more so than the Getty family's fortune or the notoriety of the ransom, explains why the case continues to resonate across generations. It is remembered not only for the money involved, but also for the lasting human cost that no amount of wealth can erase. Survival does not always compensate for loss, and the wounds inflicted by violent crimes often linger long after victims regain their freedom. The kidnapping officially ended in December 1973, but its consequences continued to haunt John Paul Getty III until his death in 2011. That enduring reality, more than the Getty family's fortune or the notoriety of the ransom, explains why the case continues to resonate for generations. It is remembered not only for the money involved, but also because it illustrates the long-term cost to humanity that no amount of wealth can erase. Every true crime story eventually comes to a conclusion, with the events being documented. Investigations close, courtrooms fall silent, and the press moves on to new headlines. However, some cases refuse to fade from public memory because they reveal something bigger than the crime itself. The abduction of John Paul Getty III is one such case. More than half a century has passed since a 16-year-old boy disappeared from Piazza Farnese in Rome on the morning of July 10, 1973, but the questions raised by his suffering continue to resonate. It is not simply a story of ransom or organized crime. It becomes a story of family, perception, wealth, vulnerability, and the lasting consequences of violence. Looking back at the whole picture, the tragedy unfolds in a series of stark contrasts. On one side is one of the world's wealthiest families, a name synonymous with extraordinary financial success and international recognition. On the other is a teenage boy who, despite the wealth surrounding his family, was unable to protect himself from becoming a target of organized crime. The notion that immense wealth guarantees personal security turns out to be an illusion. John Paul Getty III was not kidnapped for who he was, but for the family he was born into. It was his name, not his actions, that made him valuable to those who viewed human lives as opportunities for profit. That fact remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case. Wealth, which many believe provided protection, became the reason he was chosen as a victim. Another profound lesson stems from how the kidnapping was initially perceived. Because John Paul Getty III lived a rebellious lifestyle, spending time in the arts, frequenting nightclubs, participating in left-wing protests, and pursuing creative hobbies such as modeling, painting, and jewelry making. Some initially doubted whether his disappearance was staged. Those doubts delayed the realization that he was the victim of a real and increasingly dangerous crime. In retrospect, the case illustrates how easily assumptions based on fame can influence judgment. Public image is not proof. Personal appearance is not conclusive evidence. A person's lifestyle, friendships, or unusual choices should never determine whether their suffering is believable. The arrival of a package containing a lock of his hair and a severed ear shattered those initial assumptions in the most horrifying way imaginable, reminding the world that reality can be far more tragic than speculation. The Getty family's actions remain central to the case's enduring significance. J. Paul Getty's immediate refusal to pay the ransom became one of the most controversial decisions in modern criminal history. His explanation that paying a child's ransom might encourage further kidnappings of his 13 grandchildren in the future continued to be debated decades later. Some viewed his decision as a calculated move to prevent organized crime from exploiting his family. Repeatedly, others saw it as an example of emotional detachment overriding immediate compassion. History offers no simple answer because the recorded events cannot fully reveal the private emotions experienced by those involved. History shows that the delay prolonged his captivity, and only after irrefutable evidence of John Paul Getty III's suffering did negotiations finally lead to the ransom that guaranteed his freedom. The controversy surrounding those decisions became inseparable from the kidnapping, illustrating how public judgment often extends beyond the criminal act to include the reaction of families facing difficult choices. The subsequent investigation and legal proceedings also yielded lasting lessons about the realities of criminal justice. 9 suspects were arrested, including Girolamo Piramali and Saverio Mammoliti. But ultimately only 2 were convicted, while many others were acquitted due to lack of evidence. The vast majority of the ransom was never recovered. To many observers, those outcomes seemed incomplete, even disappointing. Yet, they also demonstrated an essential principle of justice. Courts cannot convict based solely on suspicion, no matter how notorious the crime. Evidence, not public opinion, is what determines legal responsibility. Organized crime presents particularly significant investigative challenges precisely because its members operate in secrecy, with clear divisions and based on loyalty. The Getty kidnapping demonstrates that even one of the world's most famous criminal cases is subject to the same legal standards as any other prosecution. However, perhaps the most profound lesson lies in what happens after the headlines fade. Public attention naturally focuses on the kidnapping, the ransom negotiations, and the court proceedings. But the longest chapter of the story unfolds quietly for decades afterward. John Paul Getty III underwent reconstructive surgery in 1977 to repair his severed ear, but the psychological consequences of the ordeal remain. His struggle with alcohol, drugs, and tranquilizers ultimately led to a devastating medical crisis in 1981, when the combined use of alcohol, Valium, and methadone resulted in severe liver failure and a serious stroke. The consequences left him quadriplegic, severely impaired speech and vision, dependent on a wheelchair, and requiring constant care for the rest of his life. These events remind us that the impact of violent crime often lasts long after rescue. His imprisonment ended in December 1973, but its ghost haunted him for the rest of his life. That distinction is crucial. Survival and recovery are not the same. Victims may regain their freedom while still suffering physical and mental consequences that last. For decades, John Paul Getty III died in England on February 5, 2011, at the age of 54. Nearly 38 years had passed since his abduction. During that time, generations had changed, organized crime had evolved, and countless other criminal cases had garnered international attention. Yet his story lives on, not only because of its sensationalism, but also because it touches upon universal questions that remain relevant. What responsibility comes with such a vast fortune? How should families respond when faced with impossible choices? Can justice fully compensate for irreparable harm? And perhaps most importantly, how should society remember victims whose identities are obscured by the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the crimes inflicted upon them? The ongoing cultural interest in the case reflects these enduring questions. The story inspired the 2017 film All the Money in the World and the 2018 television series Trust, which introduced audiences to the events surrounding the Getty family. These adaptations show that the kidnapping remains one of the most iconic real-life criminal cases of modern times. However, none of these works can fully capture the reality of the young man's life. Behind every film, documentary, article, and podcast is the recorded history of a 16-year-old boy, taken hostage as a normal teenager and bearing the wounds that will stay with him for the rest of his life. As the story concludes, it's worth returning to the question posed at the beginning. What happens when the grandson of one of the world's richest men disappears? Historical records reveal a bitter answer. Wealth could not prevent the kidnapping. Wealth cannot erase family discord. Wealth cannot erase the suffering endured during nearly 5 months of captivity. Wealth cannot guarantee complete justice through the courts. And wealth cannot restore lost years of health and freedom. The kidnapping of Getty remains significant not because of the enormous sums of money involved, but because it exposed the limits of what money can achieve. Human vulnerability exists regardless of financial status, reputation, or social influence. Violence leaves consequences that no fortune can fully compensate for. Ultimately, the story of John Paul Getty III is remembered not only as one of the most famous ransom cases in history, but also as a profound human tragedy. It reminds us that behind every statistic, every newspaper headline, and every court ruling is an individual whose life has been forever altered. Millions of dollars were demanded, negotiated, and partially paid, becoming historical events. But they are not the true measure of the case. The real price paid by a young man whose adolescence ended in a remote cave in Calabria and whose life is forever divided into 2 chapters, before the abduction and after. That is the legacy left by the abduction of John Paul Getty III, a legacy not measured by wealth, but by the lasting human consequences of a crime that continues to resonate throughout history.